Do great players make great teachers? That's a question that may not seem that important to answer. But I found that when I found the answer to this question, I understood way more about teaching and violin playing than I ever had before. You see, a lot of people assume that if someone can do something well, that they can also teach it well, or at least teach it well enough so that others who aren't at their level can get close to them. But the reality is that a lot of people who are able to perform at a high level are using a lot of intuition that they're not able to actually explain to others. And this is why there often seems to be a disconnect between great players and their students. Before we get into more, I'm David. I've been playing the violin for over 20 years, teaching for over 10, and making tutorials online for the past 8 years. I studied the Dounis Method, and this method teaches how non-talented players like myself can reach a high level of playing by learning to use their natural instincts. If you're sick and you want to get better, you go to someone that knows how to cure your problem. You don't necessarily just go to any healthy person and assume they'll know, because being healthy alone isn't a qualification for curing someone else's problem. And the exact same principle applies to violin playing and teaching. Just because you have a great vibrato doesn't necessarily mean you're able to teach someone with a bad vibrato how to also get a great vibrato. And this is something that I didn't really understand when I was starting out. You see, I look at all the great players, and I try to find the exercises that they were doing and try to imitate them myself in order to imitate their playing. But as I learned the Dunis Method, it became clear that these great players were doing a lot of things that they weren't even aware of or able to properly explain. For example, with the vibrato. In order to have a great vibrato, you need to understand the mechanics of the movement, which consists of a rubbing motion and a rotation motion with the finger. But outside of that, you also need to understand how to do things like balance the finger so that it feels comfortable, and how to release the impulse of the vibrato, so it doesn't feel like you're pumping the vibrato back and forth. Now this applies to every technique on the violin. There's so much more going on than most players realize, and especially the great players who are able to do those techniques at a very high level. But when a player is doing them great, the mechanics of these motions are actually done using your natural instincts. For example, with the vibrato. One of the natural movements that's used to do the vibrato is a rubbing motion. And this rubbing motion can be thought of as if you're erasing a mark on the fingerboard with your finger. When you imagine that you're doing a vibrato and you're just erasing a mark on the fingerboard with your finger, it starts to feel like a lot simpler movement. But a lot of teachers will teach the vibrato in the context of making it a very mechanical movement. And while it's important to feel that the vibrato is even, you won't really get the feeling for this natural movement of erasing or rubbing if you simply practice vibrato with the metronome and moving your hand up and down the fingerboard until you can do it faster. In fact, practicing the vibrato like that can actually create a lot of problems. While it makes logical sense that you want the vibrato to be even, if you don't learn the proper feeling of the mechanics that are involved, you won't really feel comfortable with the movement. And that's an example of where a lot of teachers, even though if they can do the vibrato well, can't exactly teach their students to do it at their level. Now you may be wondering, how do I know all this? And how do I understand the mechanics of these techniques? And how to do them with the natural instincts? Well, this is because I've been studying the Dunis Method. And Dounis observed that a lot of the great players use their natural instincts and use intuition to learn the violin. While these players often have great teachers, most of what they learn isn't necessarily taught directly by their teachers. It's things that they figure out intuitively. This is why if you simply go and study with the teacher of a great player, you won't necessarily be able to reach their level. Now this isn't to say that great players don't have great advice to give their students, but the reality is that in order to completely transform a player that's not talented into one that's able to play at a very high level, there's a lot more things that you're going to need to fix about their playing than a great player might realize. A great player can be very helpful for students that are also very talented and can show them a lot of helpful insights. But if the basis for their playing isn't where it needs to be, a lot of the things that great players teach can be difficult to grasp for players who are not talented. For example, if a great player is teaching a student how to play a fast piece, they may start with the assumption that the student already understands things like how to release impulses and how fast playing is different from slow playing. These are things that aren't explicitly taught to a lot of students, but great players will intuitively pick up on these things. A great player will never emphasize every note the same when they're playing fast. They'll emphasize the impulse notes and then release. But a student who's not talented and has always been taught to start slow and gradually speed up to the fast tempo won't really understand this concept. And as a result, when they reach the fast tempo or get close to it, they'll really struggle with playing fast. And the great player who's teaching them won't quite understand how to teach them to fix that. But Dounis did, and he came up with many exercises to address this specific thing. More on that in another video. With his method, Dounis was able to break down all these techniques into natural movement patterns. He taught how to use a natural instinct for each technique. And not only is this a much simpler way of teaching and learning, it also allows you to reach a much higher level of playing. And it gives your playing that same natural look and feel that the great players have. I brought up the example of the vibrato because that's a technique that I used to really struggle with. I used to feel tense, and even though I tried out many different exercises that I saw online, none of them seemed to really address the issues I was having. I was able to do the motion slow, but when I sped it up and I tried to do it for extended periods of time, I would get tense, and my vibrato would always sound pumped. But after learning the vibrato with the Dounis method, I not only understood the mechanics of how the vibrato should work, but also the fact that the vibrato should release. This means that after doing the first shake of the vibrato, the hand should feel like it's just rebounding back and forth on its own momentum, and not that you're actually pumping it back and forth each time. Now, the vibrato is just one aspect of my playing that has improved thanks to the Dounis method. I've actually been able to go through all the other techniques of the violin and been able to understand them in depth. And not only that, I've been able to actually teach them to others. For example, things like the fast bow strokes, like the fast détaché, used to really be confusing to me because I started with a slow bow stroke and tried to speed it up. When in reality, the fast détaché is actually done using the fingers and not the whole arm or hand. But the great thing about the Dounis method is it's not primarily focused on technique. The end goal of this method is actually to teach players, even untalented ones like myself, on how to play expressively. And as you develop a more natural technique, you'll find that you naturally play more expressively. But of course, there's many other aspects of playing expressively that are not just technical. And that's the other thing that a lot of great players often struggle to teach to their students. In order to play expressively, you have to actually understand phrasing. For example, if you're working on a piece like the Tchaikovsky Concerto, a lot of the expression comes from understanding when to speed up notes and when to slow them down. This isn't something that the composer explicitly writes in the music, but it's something that great players understand by using their inner voice. Because when you sing a passage and are able to really analyze what you're doing, you're able to actually understand what the composer intended. And this also can give you different interpretations of a piece that also sound just as expressive as another player. When you understand things like which notes to impulse and emphasize, when to speed up and slow down notes, and how to actually make an overall phrase work and connect with previous phrases, you'll understand how these great players were able to play expressively, and that it wasn't something that they just felt and didn't really have to think about much. This was something that they were constantly doing and always thinking about in their playing. And that's the aspect of great playing that I think can be even harder to teach, especially to someone that's not talented. But this is something that the Dounis method has taught me, and not only has it made my playing more expressive, but it's actually made my practice sessions way more enjoyable. If you're interested in learning more about this method, check out some of the resources below, including my free ebook.